Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining. I apologize. I did not realize we were live yet. My name is Matt Kreis. I serve as the general counsel for the Center for Community Progress. As you've been listening to all of these presentations today for our VAD Academy, no doubt all of you have a pretty solid picture by now of that one property or multiple properties that are sitting on your own block or on the block next to you. And you likely already know that the property is stuck, but what keeps it stuck? What keeps it in that perpetual state where it's hard to get a handle on it? Well, one critical reason is the fact that this property may be mired in thousands of dollars of property tax debt that's incredibly difficult to resolve. The ability to address that debt and those problems are tied up in a pretty complex legal and constitutional mess. And my job today is to try to uncover some of those complex reasons for you today and give you a little bit better of an understanding of that system. Before we do, however, I want to talk about, we're going to talk a little bit at some point about some possible ideas for reform. Right. I want to lead, though, with this sentiment from one of my colleagues at Community Progress. And I want to say it out loud here so that you know that as we talk about reform and new policies, we're asking you all to think about making sure that at the top of our mind, the communities that are most impacted by these systems, right? These lower income communities, often predominantly communities of color in so many cities, they're Black and brown communities, and recognizing that our new approach must be shaped and driven by their lived experiences and their seat at the table. And I want to make sure that that's clear as we continue to go down this path, talking about delinquent property tax today. So our agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we care about this system. We already kind of introduced that idea. I'm going to talk a little bit more and a little longer about what is it. I'll talk for a little bit about a recent decision from the Supreme Court, which actually had quite a bit to say about tax foreclosure. And then finally, we'll spend some time on how do we think about reform going forward. So first of all, why do we care? I want to first go ahead and give a shout out to my colleagues at the Center for Community Progress, in particular, my colleague, Kim Graziani, who serves as a senior advisor to the technical assistance team, for the creation of our reimagined delinquent property tax report, which a lot of these next few slides pull information from. And if you want to learn more about, is a great resource to be able to take some time and look through it. One of the things I want to talk about first, well, why are property taxes important? They are a huge percentage of the revenue that local governments can control, right? There's a lot of revenue that may come in that there isn't as much control over, but 85% of locally controlled revenue is from property taxes, right? That's 30. They are also 30% of all local government revenues and roughly 75% of all local government tax revenues. So the property tax amount, the money that's coming in is really important. And it pays for things like schools and street lamps and all of these things and public safety issues and other things. So it's a critically important source of how we are able to provide essential services to our neighborhoods. But how we've collected these taxes in the past has been problematic, to say the least, right? From the way properties are assessed, to the lack of outreach or the availability of tax relief programs or circuit breakers for other folks that provide financial and other support earlier in the process, all the way to the taking of property by private out-of-town investors over a few $100s in delinquent property taxes, and more. There's a deep and awful racist history of how this system, as well as many others, have been used to exploit communities of color. There are a lot of good research pieces out there. Andrew Carl is one who's done some interesting research on Chicago, where I'm from, called Capitalizing on the Urban Fiscal Crisis, Predatory Tax Buyers in the 1970s Chicago. Another, just one of many examples of how the tax system's been used. So as we think about this system, we have to understand that history and how it's been exploited in the past to make sure as we're trying to fix it, that we keep those things top of mind. There we go. Time also. Why also do we care? We care because time is the worst enemy of vacant property. The longer we let that property sit there, the longer the problems persist. We hear the worse the problems get. We hear stories from all of our partners, and I spent a lot of time in local government, can attest to this as well. People are in some of these vacant homes within 24 hours or a week or even 3 weeks of that property becoming empty and vacant, and stripping it of things that might be worth something, copper wire, copper pipes, or other things like that. But over time, that property just starts to deteriorate. And a couple of pictures here from a site visit and some work that me and some of my colleagues did in Raton, New Mexico. This building on the left was an old sort of commercial retail building that was in beautiful, the walls were in decent shape, but over time, the roof started to leak, water started to damage most of the floor, and it may no longer be salvageable. So time is a real thing that we have to deal with, and we need to understand that when we're trying to design systems for delinquent property tax enforcement. So what keeps it stuck, right? This slide, again, from our report, Reimagining Delinquent Tax Enforcement, right? If the taxes and other municipal debts on the house equal more than the home's value is, and when I say market value, I mean what somebody would pay for that property, then it's going to be stuck. And the question we frame in the publication is, would you buy that property? And so if nobody's going to pay more than that debt, then that property is going to sit there over time. So that's something that we need to keep in mind as we're looking at this here. And that's one of the main drivers that keeps these properties sort of stuck in this limbo. So what's the most effective intervention? Well, when we're talking about vacant and abandoned properties, we're talking about trying to transfer those properties as soon as we can get a handle on them, right, to more responsible owners. Right? And this is just an example of if we can get a handle on it before it starts to go down this path of deterioration, there are things that we can do. And this is just an example of what that might look like from Shelby County, Tennessee. All right, so those are the reasons, why we care about this process. It's really important that we have the right system in place. But before we dive into, well, what can we do about it? Let's talk a little bit about the what is it section. Now, before we do that, there's something you should know here. There are literally hundreds of different ways that local governments implement the property tax. And more so, there are hundreds of different ways that they enforce unpaid or delinquent property taxes, right? So what we're going to do, this is our attempt to set a baseline for some common delinquent property tax enforcement terms and introduce some key components of what we consider to be a more equitable system, a more effective system, and a more efficient system to be able to address those bad properties. Now, these components are framed throughout this little section as questions to you, to the audience, to get you to start thinking about your own local system, because it looks different everywhere. And then trying to get you to think a little bit more about how those specific components could be or might not be part of an equitable, efficient, or effective system in your own town. So let's start with some setting of just some real quick common terms that we are going to use today. One, property tax system. When I say property tax system, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second, I mean the full system of property tax administration, from when the assessor values that property to when that assessment is finalized, to when you're billed for your property taxes, to the collection of those property taxes, and then to what we do to enforce unpaid property taxes. When I'm talking about delinquent property tax enforcement, I'm talking about a process or a component of that property tax system. It's that thing that happens at the very end if somebody is unable or unwilling to pay their property taxes. When I use the word tax lien, what I mean by this is the lien that goes against the piece of property that is delinquent and is a priority lien. And that means that the government gets first crack at it. So it's above liens like mortgage liens and other things on the property. And it's imposed by law. usually it's by the state statute, on a property to secure the payment of those taxes. And then the last phrase that I'll define for you right now is the term redemption period, which is the time during which an owner or somebody with an interest in the property, like a mortgage holder, can repay the taxes, the unpaid taxes, the interest, the penalties, the costs, all of those things in order to prevent the loss of the property, right? So that is all of the time that that person might have to make sure that it doesn't go any further down that enforcement path. So those are some of the terms that I'll be using. And here's what the key components of that property tax system are. And again, I'm talking about the entire property tax system, right? From determining the value of the property to establishing the tax rate, so what percentage of that value is going to be subject to the tax, to determining if the property is even subject to tax. Maybe it's owned by a nonprofit or a governmental entity that isn't subject to it. Then applying any sort of tax relief, exemptions or deferrals or things like that. And then finally determining what the tax bill is, then collecting the tax. And then that final piece is enforcement. So in our conversations, we're really focused on that bad property. So we don't spend as much time talking about 1 through 5 on this slide as we do talking about 6. That's the focus of what we want to talk about. But these 5 systems are the most critical part of the system to make sure that by the time we get to enforcement, we're dealing only with those properties that are hopefully truly vacant or abandoned. Okay. So we excuse me, having trouble with the language today. We focus on those first 5 slides. We'll spend just a little bit of time here. But it's important to note that these first 5 stages have the greatest opportunity to prevent future vacancy and support financially insecure occupants, right? It's imperative that communities focus on equity in these stages to prevent property loss and unintentional harm. While we don't focus a lot on occupied properties in this presentation, there are some examples of support that communities can provide in one of these 5 stages, including making sure that property tax assessments are accurate and fair. There's many stories out there explaining how unfair assessments have been in predominantly Black communities and many communities across the country. Making sure we're providing homestead exemptions to all owner occupants, and rebates or credits for financially insecure households to reduce that property tax burden. We want to ensure that the application for those relief processes are not burdensome, that we have assistance to make sure people can fill out the forms the right way, and make sure that we have multifaceted public awareness campaigns so that people really know what these things are. We've got to offer things like payment options, such as monthly payment plans, cash payment, payment in community locations, right? So lots of examples out there, and a couple of ideas that are examples. Michigan in 2015 enacted a law that allows a county treasurer to reduce yearly interest rates on delinquent taxes from 12 to 18% down to 6% for financially struggling owner occupants, and then stretch out their payments over 5 years to pay off back taxes as part of a payment agreement. Rhode Island has the Madeline Walker Act, as a state law designed to help owners who have fallen behind on their taxes or other liens to avoid losing their home at a tax sale. Rhode Island Housing, the state agency, purchases the delinquent tax liens from local governments if the homeowner doesn't pay and holds them for around 5 years. During that time, the agency reaches out to the homeowners, does in-person visits, and tries to connect them to the appropriate resources to address some of the challenges that are preventing them from paying the bill. Payment plans, all kinds of other things might be really helpful. So that's just a little bit of time on what we can do to make sure that those taxes are more fair, more equitable. There's a lot more that can be done and barely scratch the surface, but I want to make sure that we touch on that as we're thinking about it. So as you're thinking about your own property tax system, right? Just a couple of quick questions for you to remember. How and when our properties are assessed? Is it fair? Are there payment plans or deferrals, or can interest and penalties be lowered or even eliminated for financial hardship? Is notice provided early and in a meaningful manner? Are people really getting it according to constitutional standards? And is there sufficient outreach or, very important, legal assistance offered to taxpayers in need? We'll talk a little bit more about some ideas for reform a little later. But now I want to move us into the enforcement process, which is really what we're here to talk and learn a little bit more about. So if we design it right, the whole property tax system, then this enforcement part should mostly just be about those vacant and abandoned properties causing the most harm, or speculator-owned properties where the owner has walked away. But to be clear, we also have to think about another part of our equity analysis before we go too far down this path. Our focus in the first 5 stages is really on trying to help that struggling homeowner, trying to hang on to the family home, right? Really critical and important. But as that property becomes vacant and abandoned, our equity focus needs to shift a little bit more to that struggling neighbor who still lives in the neighborhood, who has to live next to that property that's potentially unsecured and dangerous, that might fall down at any moment, that is bringing down neighborhood morale, and that is submarining property values on the entire block. And those rights matter as well. So this enforcement section works in a way that there's just some basic elements to it, right? If the property taxes aren't paid, generally speaking, penalties and interest accrue and ultimately become some kind of a lien or priority lien usually against the property. Considering those taxes are usually this first priority lien, again, meaning they must be paid before other liens such as mortgages, they usually hold the ultimate control of whether the local government is paid and whether local government, if the property is sold or transferred, and whether the local government can foreclose on those delinquent taxes and move that property through to new, more responsible ownership. Notice must be given to the owner and interested parties, and they must be offered an opportunity to redeem the property. Those rights are critical and must be preserved throughout the process. Usually the redemption happens through full payment. And then finally, after that opportunity to redeem expires, there is generally an enforcement event. We'll talk about that in just a minute. That's a key part of this, where either the property itself or the debt is transferred or sold for collection. So as we are talking about delinquent property tax enforcement, this enforcement event is the key. And here's where we really start to see differences in different jurisdictions across the country, right? Again, we've got 50 states. Each state has a different system, and within each state, it often varies from county to county, and even in certain states, looking at you, New York, from city to city. Here's our perhaps oversimplified way of presenting one variation of, how we might look at all of these approaches and group them into one of 2 buckets, or one of 3 buckets, I should say. Many jurisdictions first may try to, that enforcement event is less about selling or transferring the property. Their first enforcement event is about trying to collect the debt. And so they sell the debt. They sell the right to enforce that tax lien, right, to a private investor in the attempt to get paid back. And then at the end of that process, if the tax lien investor is not, if the owner doesn't pay back the tax lien investor, then there's the right for the tax lien investor usually to foreclose on or compel the transfer of the property. Contrast that with jurisdictions that do not sell that debt to a private investor, tax lien investor, and instead give property owners all of their redemption processes and time in a different way, and they sell the property, right? They sell the dirt of the property. So they're not offering the certificate or the right to collect a debt, they're actually selling the property itself. And that's one of the 2 ways, and some jurisdictions authorize the use of both of those tools. Now, the way these 2 things look is very different in either places. When you sell the property, you could sell the property subject to redemption at the very end of the process. So if you have a 2-year redemption period, you will then, at the very end of that process, they foreclose on the right of redemption and we sell the property to a new owner, at which case the owner's right to redeem that property expires and the property is transferred to the new owner. So that's how it might look in some jurisdictions. So that's just, it's very complicated. It talks about, I'm trying to talk about a whole bunch of different things in a short amount of time, but the idea is, do you sell the debt or do you sell the dirt? And I'll be honest with you, our organization, we look at the idea of selling the dirt as a much more efficient process, particularly when we're talking about vacant and abandoned properties and the harm that they cause. In our publication, the Reimagined Delinquent Tax Enforcement publication, There's a great chart in there that talks about how we can look at what happens when the tax lien is put up for sale and what happens when the government can retain the lien and what are some of their options for being able to put in place a system that might be a little bit more equitable, efficient, and effective, right? And ultimately what we're looking at is what is that outcome? Is that outcome going to result in the property sort of cycling back through the system, which can often happen in the context of property tax lien sales? Or is it going to result in a transfer of insurable title to this home to a new, more responsible owner? That's one of the things that we urge people to sort of take a look at. A couple of the other reasons why we don't typically favor tax lien sales, in particularly when it comes to vacant and abandoned properties, is they don't typically bring in more revenue than when you just sell the property at a sale of an auction of the property, right? We've done some research in the past around that, research in Rochester, New York, and Baltimore, Maryland. We did not conclusively find that the sale of tax liens was the most effective mechanism to maximize public revenue. In fact, for those vacant and abandoned properties where the tax lien was sold, significant public costs were required to address the public safety and physical deterioration of that lengthy process. Second, in discussion with communities across the country, we found that very few private tax lien investors are actually interested in taking care of the property. It's more of a financial mechanism to ensure that local governments get paid up front and can count on that money to do other things. But if our interest is in vacant and abandoned property, we want to try to get it to a new owner. We conducted an informal survey from counties across Maryland several years ago, where we found less than 0.001% of private buyers foreclosed on the owner's right of redemption and took title to the property, a critical step to trying to get the property back to productive use. So is your property tax system effective? There's a lot of different ways that we look at how do we decide whether or not what you've got is going. We've already reviewed some of the key questions about equity, though I should point out that if we get to the enforcement and foreclosure part of the process, we should always maintain some flexibility to provide off-ramps to those vulnerable owners or families who kind of accidentally got caught up in the system, right? Maybe that's making sure there's flexibility to reduce or forgive some of the debt. Maybe it means waiving certain tax bills or making exemptions retroactive. There's a whole lot of things to think about, but for all those reasons, we want to make sure we have equity baked in, but we also want to make sure at the end of the day, it's effective and it's efficient so that property doesn't stay longer in that harm-inducing state, right? So are we maximizing payments and equitable off-ramps? Are we making that balance correctly prior to abandonment or deterioration, right? Are you engaged, is your local jurisdiction engaged in selling the debt or the dirt or both, right? And again, thinking what I just said a little bit more about how the sale of the dirt or the sale of the property to a new owner instead of the sale of the debt might be a more effective intervention. Are we providing maximum notice once to all interested parties, the way the Constitution mandates, by mail, by publication, by posting, which ultimately is very key because that kind of a notice, meeting due process standards, is what results in the transfer of insurable title. That is title that an insurance company looks back at and says, yes, due process was met. I'm willing to insure the title to this property. Is your process transparent, right? Do people understand how it works and what the deadlines are, so that it's clear that if you don't do these certain things by this time, then this is the consequence or this is what's going to happen? Is there a process, if you do have a sale of the property, to make sure that the purchasers who are purchasing those properties are responsible, right? That you're not just selling it to folks who are going to not pay their taxes and the property is just going to end up in the site, or speculate or not maintain the property and the property will just end up back in the same cycle. So those are some of the key questions we'd urge folks to ask as they think about it. You're thinking about efficiency, just a few quick questions, which is, one, are we making sure that we're trying to resolve all of these public debts at the same time, right? We've got this tax debt, there's a cost to enforcing it, but what if this property has become a real problem for code enforcement or for other folks, right? What about if the taxpayers have spent a lot of money just trying to board it up or to remove dangerous debris from being dumped on the property, or a whole host of other reasons? So are we including all those public costs in that redemption amount? Do we have duplicative processes that cost more money and more time? We should get it right. We should make sure people get the right notice. We should make sure there's an opportunity to be heard. We should do that, but multiple opportunities over time. And we should get those things right. But if we continue to duplicate some of those things, that can be an inefficient part of it. And then finally, do we have tools in place to make sure that these bad properties, these vacant abandoned properties, can be expedited, right? And maybe that means that, because the property is vacant and abandoned, they get a little less time to redeem the debts that are owed against the property, right? So those are some of those key questions that could be really important. So what is more efficient and more equitable and more effective in the context of what we're talking about, right? And I think that, one of the things that we put out there is judicial in rem tax foreclosure is a tool that can be both effective and efficient. And as we all know, the devil's in the details, right? We can design the best system, but in practice, we have to actually make sure that each of these components are responsibly carried out and are being effectuated to accomplish the goals that we want them to, right? So, but if you design a system of judicial tax enforcement, it gives you the outline to be able to make sure that there are effective and efficient policies in place. We want to focus on liability against the property itself and not the owner, and not pursue a whole bunch of rather inefficient individual or personal collection tactics. We just want to deal with the property and either get the payment for the taxes or move on. And again, speaking about vacant and abandoned properties. If we have it supervised by a court, we can get the system that is a little bit more accurate and fair. A judge is overseeing this process, including that the owner has had adequate protections of their constitutional rights, like the right to surplus proceeds, if any exists, if there's a sale at the end of the process, the right to make sure that their notice process meets due process standards. Does that system, judicial in rem, if design right, can result in a transfer of title to a new owner that is insurable? And it ultimately resolves this incredibly unfortunate process as cleanly as it can be done, giving the new owner the best chance to be able to move this part forward. What else is efficient and effective? When we recognize where our property tax system sits within the broader framework of how we as a local jurisdiction are trying to address vacant and abandoned properties. So that is something that our organization has put out there a whole lot as a fix it up, pay it up, give it up scheme. I suspect you probably had a little bit of that from your code enforcement learning earlier today from my colleague Libby. But the idea is if the property starts to deteriorate or becomes abandoned, we want the owner to be able to fix it up. We should make resources available to do it if there's any out there, particularly for struggling homeowners, right? And we want to give them the opportunity to do that. If they don't, and it's becoming a harm, then we need to be able to try to find a way to compel, to do the work ourselves, to make sure that it doesn't harm the neighbors or other folks. And if folks are unwilling to fix it up or pay back the costs of making it safe, then they need to be prepared to potentially give it up. And this is where the delinquent property tax enforcement system needs to sit, right? So that it is a clear and efficient and effective way of taking that vacant and abandoned property that is causing harm and moving it through this system so that it's got that give it up component. So those are some of the ways that we talk about this system. We talk about efficient and effective. All right. So I told you all of that, only now to spend a few minutes to tell you how the United States Supreme Court has recently weighed in and influenced many, though certainly not all, delinquent tax enforcement systems. Your system itself might be changing. And so it's important to talk about this case a little bit so that what you know or knew about your delinquent tax enforcement system, so that you're prepared to kind of keep an eye out for some of the changes that might be coming. So here's the key takeaway from the case, right? Local governments must provide an opportunity for property owners to recover any value in the property that exceeds the total amount of taxes and other public debt owed, right? The failure to return those excess proceeds is an unconstitutional taking in violation of the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. That's what the Supreme Court said in a 9-0 decision, which was huge and has a big impact. However, if you live in a jurisdiction where the county or municipality has an enforcement event, and we just talked about those, sale of the debt, sale of the dirt, or there's some sort of final sale of the property, and there is a mechanism for the former owners or lien holders to get their hands on that money, those excess value or proceeds that the sale might have generated above what the county or municipality was owed in terms of total tax debt, then you're less likely to see some big changes in the law, right? You might. And if that's the case and that's your jurisdiction and you know how that works, then go ahead and take a brief nap for the next few minutes. No, please don't. I promise it'll be really interesting. But some jurisdictions, such as those where the property at the end of this whole enforcement event, where the property is actually just simply transferred to the local government or a tax lien or tax certificate holder without a process to determine if any surplus exists above that tax amount owed, like say a public auction, well, then these places, you might be seeing some changes in your local jurisdiction. So that's an overview of what those are. The case itself is, the set of facts is are this. Ms. Tyler is a 94-year-old woman who moved into assisted living and vacated her condo. Right? She stopped paying her taxes and all other debts associated with the property sometime around 2010 or 2011. After about 5 years, Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is, foreclosed on the property tax debt, including all the interest and associated costs. And that amount at the time of the foreclosure was about $15,000. And I'm using the term foreclosure loosely, right? The way the law in Minnesota talks about this system is a little bit different, but I think foreclosure is more something that everybody can kind of relate to and understand. Essentially, they took title to this property at the end of this process. And they took title to the condo. After about 15 months after the foreclosure, right, the county sold the condo. They sold it for roughly $40,000. So there was a difference between what they foreclosed on it for and the amount they sold it for. Ms. Tyler partnered with an organization called the Pacific Legal Foundation to sue the county, claiming she was owed the difference between what the county was owed and what the condo sold for, which is roughly $25,000. The Supreme Court ruled that by allowing the county to keep the property surplus sale, that the plaintiff had put forth a plausible case that the Minnesota law violates the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. And I realize I'm paraphrasing quite a lot here, but the general gist of it is that we care a lot because this decision actually impacts key tools used by counties, cities, and land banks to address vacant and abandoned properties. Right? There's a lot of questions that the case doesn't answer, which I'll get to in just a moment, but one of the tools might be, the ability to kind of draw down certain properties before a public auction, which many communities have held and have thought of as inviting a whole lot of speculative interest. Often the properties are sold to folks who don't necessarily have, neighborhood redevelopment at the top of their mind, and those properties end up sitting there and cycling back through. So a lot of communities were using that process to pull some of those vacant and abandoned properties out of the system and try to do other things. Like renovate it or create first-time homebuyer programs or all kinds of things. Those systems where they were able to pull that out before there was some kind of an auction are now called into question and are likely not viable post-Tyler in many ways. There's certainly ways that other communities are looking to explore that. We also care because this actually presents, on a more positive note, this presents a real opportunity to make changes and to prioritize both equity, efficiency, and effectiveness. In this process a little bit more. We'll talk about what I mean when I say that in just a second here. That said, lots of questions remain, right? Well, how do we determine if there's value? In Minnesota, we had a sale and then we had an amount that was foreclosed upon. And so it seems fairly simple, but the question of when does the taking occur matters, because when do we want to value the property? When do we want to attach some sort of a value to the property? In the case in Minnesota, that happened about 15 months after the county took ownership of the property. Maybe that would have been more appropriate a little bit earlier in the process. How do we determine if there was excess value that was returned? They had, they sold the property in Minnesota in one way by a negotiated sale. But how do we determine whether there was excess value? One way that we've talked about a lot is a public sale. The public sale is generally a pretty defensible way based on a whole mortgage foreclosure and bankruptcy law and a bunch of other ways to say, all right, we're going to offer this property for sale. Whatever somebody will pay for it will be the value we'll attach to it. And if there are any surplus amounts above what the tax debt was that was owed, we'll return that to the former owner, right? But the Supreme Court didn't say that's how it had to be. They left open a whole lot of speculation as to what other systems might work. Could we get an appraisal? Could we do other things? How should the excess value be distributed? Are tax lien buyers insulated from liability? We try to answer many of these questions in one of our policy brief around these issues, which I'll share the link with at the end of this process, as well as a couple of the other links I've talked about at the end of this presentation. But lots of questions are out there. We try to help folks answer those questions, but they're important to keep in mind as we're thinking about designing or redesigning some of our systems to address some of the title that are out there. So we talked a little bit about what property tax foreclosure is and why it's important, right? And how we think about it and how we think about systems that could be a little bit more equitable, efficient, and effective. We've talked about how the Supreme Court has influenced or kind of mandated that change be made in many jurisdictions to the delinquent tax enforcement process. So we're thinking that now is actually a pretty good time to start thinking about reform. It's a good time to start to harness that momentum. And we want to make sure that one of the things that the Supreme Court case talked about was they talked about equity a lot. And in that case, they were talking about home equity. And that means value in the property, what the property was worth. And I want to talk about equity in terms of that is an important piece, but equity should also be about, are we treating people fairly? Is the system fair? And so we agree that equity is top of mind, and equity, in fact, should be driving reform. And so as you're thinking about reform of your own jurisdiction, I encourage you to think about it in two different buckets. One, keeping people in their homes as best we can. We don't want this system to be used to be stripping homes and wealth from families anywhere. Secondarily, the system should be used to address the VAD next door, right? It's really important. It's a big deal, and I want to make sure that both of those two things are talked about. So first, let's talk a little bit about keeping people in their homes. Right. We already know that the bad tax enforcement system is most harmful to low income communities, and especially Black, Brown, and other communities of color. So again, we talked about some of these things earlier. Do we have our assessment rights? Do we have the right property tax exemptions? Do we have the ability to allow for payment plans, things like that? One thing we didn't really talk about is, do family members qualify when an owner passes on and they leave this property to their family? And there isn't a will or it isn't probated. In many cases, these families feel secure in their ownership. They want to know that, but that process creates something called heirs properties, or family land that can be, that process, that whole lack of a will or lack of probate can create some tangled and cloudy title issues that are really important to try to resolve. Otherwise, you get caught up in some of these processes. You might not qualify for tax relief. You might not qualify for repair grants or things like that. So again, thinking about how those folks, we want to make sure that they have the ability to stay in their homes and perhaps help them clean up some of the issues that may lead to some of those problems, right? And making sure folks can claim surplus. If we do have the right process in place, maybe a public sale, and there is some sort of surplus revenue generated, that the folks who own that home, either as a family member or in title, have the ability to access any of those proceeds or excess proceeds. It should be clear and accessible to all. So that's a really important piece of driving reform. And so for a practice spotlight, I just want to bring up Washtenaw County, Michigan. That's where Ann Arbor, Michigan is. They have a whole host of different things. I don't want to talk about everything that the county does for sake of time. They offer homestead and poverty exemptions, payment plans, homeownership assistance funds, et cetera. Lots of different things. But the one thing I do want to talk about is when we talked about the heirs property and people don't have that will and testament. The Washtenaw County created this Homes for Generations programs, this Homes for Generations program. That's a really great thing that a lot of other communities in Michigan are looking at doing, where folks that don't have a last will and testament can access this problem. So the county treasurer and the probate judge in Washtenaw County designed a program to assist those families that were living in inherited homes who didn't have that will or hadn't probated the property. This project connects the descendants of those deceased owners with pro bono legal help and works with families to establish clear title, allowing homeowners access to tax code entitlements, to financing, and other benefits of homeownership. So just a real, one program, but another example of a way that we can do better at protecting home equity. I can tell you that county, for the county treasurer herself, they have saved, Treasurer McCleary has saved around 24 homes already and has just about as many in the pipeline that they hope to be able to help save or get out of tax foreclosure entirely. As we're thinking about keeping people in their homes, great, but we've also got to address the bad next door. So what do we need to do that, right? Shorten the process. We talked about this a little bit. For homeowners who are living in the homes, 2 years, it's not a lot of time, or 3 years, whatever the appropriate amount of time is to try to help those folks get caught up, great. But when we're talking about vacant abandoned properties, that time to redeem, meaning that final moment by which we can, terminate the rights of redemption and try to move that property to a new owner, it makes a lot of sense to have that time be a lot shorter. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 6 months. Again, the idea is to move this type of property through the system a lot more quickly so that we can get it into the hands of a new owner so that it stops causing harm, right? Again, we talked about this, reasons for selling the dirt, not the debt, right? Providing judicial oversight and constitutional notice to ensure clear title. That works as part of that judicial in rem thing that we talked about a little bit earlier. And a critical piece of this is also when properties are sold, and again, let's use the public auction because that's probably the most common example now. If there's a public auction of the property at the end of this process, right? And that property, nobody wants to buy it because sometimes these vacant and abandoned properties do not get sold. What we need to do is make sure that we have the ability for the public to be able to step in and say, okay, if nobody's going to buy it for the amount of the tax debt or other things that are owed, then somebody's got to step in and responsibly manage that property and do the best they can to get that back to responsible ownership. And that is where local governments come in. That is where land banks can come in and be incredibly effective partners, and already are for the more than 300 land banks across the country. I'm not going to talk much about the great things that they can do because my other colleagues will talk about that today. So those are some of the things that we need to do to address the bad next door as we're thinking about it. And there are plenty of examples. There's a lot of changes happening right now as a result of the Tyler versus Hennepin case in state legislatures. We'll be talking about those things both internally and at the Reclaiming Vacant Property Conference in September. But for now, I just want to show you a couple of examples where, it's hard. A lot of legislators across the country don't really want to have interest or understand diving into the delinquent property tax enforcement statutes. It's not a lot of fun. It's complicated. It's complex, in many cases, probably purposefully so, to protect the system that has benefited a few, but maybe not the masses. But it is possible, right? Thinking about these two things, about how equity should drive reform, about the message of keeping people in their homes and addressing vacant and abandoned property next door, those things resonate across the spectrum. And so some examples of reform that's been happening in 2023, Illinois passed Senate Bill 1675, where to make the delinquent process a little bit more efficient and a little bit more equitable. We worked with cities of Decatur, Peoria, Rockford, Kankakee, Chicago, and most importantly with the Chicago Community Trust, who helped to really support that work and build a larger coalition to draft the bill. It makes some changes simply by restricting loopholes that allowed tax certificate investors, because Illinois sells the debt, not the dirt, but it allowed tax certificate investors to get money back plus interest if there were minor errors in a tax certificate sale. Right? It prevented tax certificates from cycling through multiple tax lien certificate sales. It reduced interest rate on certificates defaulted to the Cook County. So again, that's certificates or tax liens where nobody wanted to buy it at that first sale. And it did there's lots more stuff that needs to be done in Illinois, a lot that needs to be done to address some of the Tyler cases, but I wanted to give you an example of some of the progress that can be made and some of the more recent progress that can be made. Similarly, in West Virginia, Senate Bill 552 in 2022 included a number of smarter provisions that's going to result in a more effective and efficient delinquent property tax enforcement system. Specifically, the bill does things like giving more time between that initial tax delinquency and the sale of the tax lien or the tax certificate, which gives people a little bit more time to catch up and pay back without having extra interest attached. It decreases post-tax lien sale redemption periods to expedite the transfer of the property to a new owner for vacant and abandoned properties. It grants this West Virginia Land Stewardship Corporation, which is basically like a statewide land bank and has done some incredible things, to receive those liens that receive no bids at the first tax sale. And it grants that authority the opportunity to sell tax liens at any price. It requires the state auditor to prioritize residents and local governments in the disposition and selling some of those liens in a particular order, right? So all of these things sort of fit with a more equitable and efficient system. So all of that is to say that reform is definitely possible, right? This is a pretty complex issue, or it can be. It shouldn't be. And as we're thinking about reform and we're thinking about equity and effectiveness and efficiency, both in terms of keeping people in their homes and in making sure we address the VAD next door as quickly as possible, I want to make sure that another key point that we're trying to do is to try to reduce the complexity of this process. People should know what it looks like. People should understand it. And it shouldn't be so complex that only lawyers like me have the ability to spell it out, or other people who have been in this system for a long time. And so I want to make sure that that's clear as we talk about reform, another key goal of what reform I think should be. Here's some great resources that we've had in the past, certainly a lot more. And I look forward to talking about these and anything else we discussed both now for some questions and potentially in office hours. So that's my email. If you want to use it, feel free, and I'll do my best to get back to you as time as possible. For now, I'm going to escape out of this, stop sharing. All right.
Hi, Matt. Great job. Great job. Thank you so much for presenting. We want to go ahead and get into our Q&A portion. But before we do that, I do want to give a few quick reminders. First, our next session starts in just a few minutes. It's going to be Land Banks and Land Banking 101. Make sure you join our colleague Brian as he explains a little bit more about land banks. And then also, I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please submit them in the webinar chat so we can address them as we go along. All right, Matt, we'll hop right in if you're ready.
Sure thing, yes.
Awesome. So the first one is Tina. She would like to know, what are the mechanisms that a local government can use to clear the title on these tax delinquent properties?
I'm sorry, Crystal, can you repeat that?
Yeah, of course. What are the mechanisms that a local government can use to clear the title on tax delinquent properties?
Great question. And I apologize if I wasn't clear earlier in the presentation, but as far as being able to clear title on these tax delinquent properties, the tax foreclosure process that we talked about should clear all of those title issues, right? It should result in title. When I say insurable title at the back end, I mean clear title. Right? That means that all of those other things have been resolved. The priority lien is really critical to being able to get you there. And then something like a judicial in rem foreclosure that makes sure to foreclose all of those interests in that property in a clean way, and then results in the transfer of title, provided proper notice has been given that meets constitutional due process standards, right? If all of that is done, that should result in clear title, right? But as you're designing that system, there's a lot of different ways to think about it. You got to think about due process. You got to be familiar with that, but it also really helps to talk to title insurers. Ultimately, they're the ones that make the decision on how to, whether or not to insure the title from a certain or a type of process. And so if you can involve them in the discussion on what is needed or what they need to see to ensure that title, that might be a really effective way of developing your reform.
Awesome. So our next question is from Wayne. Are there any best practices that Community Progress can point to for ending the practice of tax lien sales?
Wayne, wonderful question. I think first off, you have to take a look at, why does the jurisdiction that you live in rely on the process of tax lien sales, right? And you need to talk to local officials and figure out folks' understanding of why that system exists, right? It's a finance tool, right? It's a way of saying, at least it is an example in Illinois that tax lien sale earlier on in the process makes sure that, or gets some money into the coffers of the local governments to pay back some of those unpaid taxes, right? As opposed to waiting 6 months or a year or something like that. So it's a timing issue. Our point is that the tax lien sales themselves don't necessarily generate more revenue. It's about the timing of when folks collect it, which is an important consideration. I don't want to undermine it, but our point is that if you instead shift to a system that is like a selling the dirt type of a system where you have the redemption period up front and you do it at the end of the process, it's not that you're collecting less money, it's just that your timing changes a little bit. So that's one thing to think about, is get folks understanding of the why, so that as you start to devise a new system, you can address some of those concerns. But as far as examples go, there are plenty of examples of folks that have shifted from selling tax liens to not. I shouldn't say plenty. It works the other way too. Rochester, New York is one example of a community that did a whole lot, almost entirely sold their entire digest of tax liens, and has shifted over the years to doing more of, using more of their judicial in rem tool. So there are a lot of examples out there of communities that have made that shift. And certainly if you want to follow up or talk later, we can provide some more.
Awesome. So Rex is asking a question that seems to piggyback off of your last statement, actually. And so he would like to know, what is the best way to encourage the transfer of title of properties whose liens do not sell in tax sale, specifically properties that have been sitting for multiple years and never sell?
That is a big question. Did you say Rex?
Yes.
Okay, great. Rex, I think that's a huge question. And I wish I could say that it was an easy policy fix, but so much of that, as you, I'm sure, know, is market-based, right? The fact is that if there was a thriving real estate or housing market, there wouldn't be that kind of an issue. And so there's a whole lot that needs to be done, right? There needs to be a large conversation with the local government and business partners and residents and community members on, changing the market, right? What kind of economic development or housing related activities can we do to sort of shift the market a little bit? But in the meantime, you've got these vacant and abandoned properties that nobody is buying at the tax sale and just kind of sit there in that limbo. And that's where an entity like a land bank can be such a great partner. Now, a land bank is only as good as the laws, the state laws that sort of create it and give it special powers, and as good as the resources, including funding, that it has to be able to manage and address that problem. But a land bank can be so helpful for an inventory like that, Rex, because it is specifically designed to manage that sort of abandoned inventory and build the kind of partnerships within the community and others to try to start to get that property to a place where somebody might have an interest in it, or a developer might be interested in it. But in the meantime, just try to take care of them and do the best they can at not being a bad neighbor for those kinds of things. So that's one tool I would urge you to consider thinking about.
Thanks, Matt. Justin would like to know, he says, Maryland passed a bill allowing counties to enact a vacant property tax that increases the property tax for vacant and abandoned properties. How would you suggest applying a tool when jurisdictions like Baltimore City has in rem foreclosure?
I'm trying to get at the question itself. What I want to make sure that I understand is whether Justin is saying that that could be a potentially harmful thing by allowing this this vacant property tax. Oh, a good thing. Got it. Okay. So I don't know a lot about that particular bill, Justin. Thank you. I saw your comment in there. That was very helpful. I don't know enough about the specific vacant tax. It all depends on how it's designed, right? Is it actually a tax? Is it a fee? All those things, like we need to know a little bit more about that. But presuming you're talking about higher tax, right, against property that is vacant, because maybe the justification is because it requires more public services to be able to address and maintain some of the problems that present. I think that we need to be cautious. The Tyler versus Hennepin case is something that we need to make sure we understand sort of how that extra tax that would, presumably be in addition to, could be seen as being, there's a lot of things in there that talk about the Eighth Amendment in terms of whether or not that would be punitive instead of for some other reason. So I want to say that it could be really interestingly with the judicial in rem system. Again, you want to make sure that all of the public costs are captured within that judicial in rem tax foreclosure case, right? So assuming those public costs are justified and appropriate, you want to make sure you get them all within that process. And assuming you're not doing it in a harmful way that's used to deprive people of their home or something like that, you want to apply all of those costs to make sure that that bid at the end of the process, at the end of the judicial in rem process, is fully loaded, right? So you get all that paid. And maybe that bid then gets driven high enough that a speculator may not be as interested in buying it and just sitting on it as they otherwise would. So Justin, I think it could potentially be a good thing, but I need to know a lot more about the actual proposal and the actual thing to be able to comment further.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. I'm searching now for more questions. This one might be one that I'm not sure if you are able to answer, but we'll pose it. Karen is asking, what about vacants that are owned by out-of-country owners? Any way to hasten the courts, create laws for out-of-country purchasers?
I think there's a couple of questions wrapped up in that, Karen. One is, and I want to go back to this little in rem thing, right, against the property concept. At the end of the day, if nobody is responsive, if the property owner isn't taking care of their property, if they aren't taking care of, if they're not paying their taxes, they're not doing what, at some point, right, if they're gone, I think it's important for the local government. We encourage an in rem system, at least I encourage it, because I think it's important for us to just say, we don't care about the owner anymore. I mean, we care, we want to provide them their constitutional rights, but at the end of the day, we care about the property, right? And so when we file this in rem tax foreclosure against the property, we don't really care at the end. So long as we provide proper notice, we don't really care what the outcome is if they continue to stay away. That's why in rem can be such an important tool for somebody in that position. As far as whether or not you want to prevent somebody from out of country being able to buy properties at potentially at property tax, a public tax auction or something along those lines, that's a whole other thing. I think that that is something you definitely want to explore with your local jurisdiction. I think it's tricky. There was a case out of the Fourth Circuit dealing with Prince George's County a few years ago, and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, United States Court of Appeals, I should say, that dealt with this issue of whether or not Prince George's could keep people from outside of the county participating in this special tax sale. Right? And I won't get into the details of the case right now, but the general consensus is you've got to have a better reason for not letting people in, and otherwise you could violate provisions of the Commerce Clause. So people being unable to do that. So I don't think that necessarily, I don't know how that applies to foreign bidders or things like that. So you want to talk with local lawyers in your jurisdiction about that. But certainly people are trying to make sure to vet bidders a little bit better at some of these sales. What are things you could do? Don't let people bid on property who may have, or their company may have delinquent taxes or outstanding code liens or things like that. That's something that's a bit more common. This can be hard to enforce. I want to be cautious about it, but those are things that we're seeing more often.
Awesome. Nicholas is asking if there are any avenues that you know to have back taxes excused for a person who wants to live in and repair an existing local property.
That's tough. I need to know a lot more about the local jurisdiction and those things. So Nicholas, I apologize. I'm not able to answer that question without a little bit more information, but hit up my email and let's see if we can help you out a little bit. And I do want to make a comment real quick, Crystal, that I've noticed a lot of people engaging in the comments,
Yes.
offering some really great insights on their own. And I don't want to, I don't want to gloss over that because I think some people have put out some really interesting stuff that I think folks
Absolutely
should pay attention to.
For sure. Tina followed up on her question asking if the land bank could utilize the same system to clear title that you mentioned before. And I know that Brian's session will cover land banks and land banking a little bit more in depth, but are you able to speak to that?
I think I'll let Brian speak to it.
Gotcha.
I think a land bank can absolutely be a part of that system,
Gotcha.
As to how and where, again, it depends on the tax, the delinquent tax enforcement laws, the powers that the local land bank has, and how they all work together. So, but I think Brian will do a little bit better job of explaining various ways that we can do it. If we don't answer it after that, we've got office hours.
Yes, we
So
do.
happy to talk about it then too.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Matt. This has been amazing. Does
you,
anyone
Kristen.
else have any more questions that they would like to pose? Okay, well, with that, please join us at 2:45 p.m. Eastern time, or I'm sorry, 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern time for our office hour. Make sure that you come in and ask questions or any other follow-ups that you might have from all sessions today. Every presenter will be there, so make sure you join us if you have any other questions or you need clarity on any other topics presented today.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Bye, guys.